The morning her father sold her, Mei Li was sitting in the corner of the silk room counting threads. That was what she did when the house felt tight around her. She would pull herself to the wooden stool beside the great bolts of fabric, prop her crutch against the wall and count. Red threads, gold threads, the thin white ones her grandfather had woven himself before his hands gave out. Counting was something she could control. Counting did not ask her to walk faster or stand straighter or be something other than what she was. She was 22 years old, and she had lived her whole life inside the walls of a merchant house in Suzhou that smelled of camphor wood and old tea, and the faint, sweet rot of silk that had sat too long in humidity. She knew every corner of it. She knew which floorboards creaked at night. She knew which walls were thin enough to hear through. She had learned these things the way all careful people learn the geography of the place that both shelters and confines them, with quiet attention over years without ever being caught at it. Her name was Mei Li. In the language of her family, it meant beautiful and lovely, which was the kind of name fathers gave daughters before they fully understood what their daughters would cost them. Her father's name was Yang, and he was a man built from smaller disappointments that had accumulated over the years until they had become something solid and permanent in him, like sediment hardening into stone. He had inherited a silk trading business from his own father and had managed to make it neither better nor worse for most of his life, which might have been acceptable if not for the cards. The card games had started as a small thing, a social thing, a thing men of his class and position did together in the evenings after business was done. They had not stayed small. Mei Li knew the numbers. She had always known the numbers. Her father kept his accounts in a leather ledger that he believed he hid well, but she had read it 4 times in the years since she learned to move through the house without making sound. She knew what he owed and to whom and at what interest. She knew which debts were old enough to have grown teeth. She knew that 3 different creditors had sent politely worded letters in the past 6 months that were not actually polite at all, and that her father had read each one at the breakfast table with a face arranged into careful calm, and then folded them into his sleeve where he believed no one would notice. She noticed everything. She had been noticing since she was 4 years old, when the illness took the proper use of her left leg. That was the year she stopped being a body that moved freely through the world and became instead a body that stayed in one place and watched. It was not a small loss. She had cried about it privately for years. She had also, over time, understood that watching carefully was its own kind of power, and that people who believed you were limited tended to speak freely in your presence, and that this was information she could use. Her 2 older sisters had been married off in the previous 5 years. The eldest to a hardware merchant in Hangzhou, a reasonable man with a round face and a steady income, who had sent polite letters ever since and visited twice. The middle sister to a fabric dyer from a family slightly below their own station, which had caused her father a week of wounded pride before the practical reality of the dowry reduction settled him. Both marriages had been arranged the way such things were always arranged, with a series of formal visits and careful negotiations, and both of her sisters had gone to their new households with packed trunks and the particular expression of women who have decided to make the best of what they have been handed. Mei Li had watched both departures from the upstairs window. She had not cried at either one. She had felt something she did not have a precise word for, a kind of cold, clear understanding that she was now the last one, and that the mathematics of her father's household had shifted in ways that pointed in one direction only. The problem from her father's perspective was the leg. He had never said this to her directly. He was not a man who said difficult things directly. He was a man who sighed in specific ways that meant specific things, who went quiet at certain moments in ways that were louder than shouting, who had a habit of looking slightly past her when they spoke, as though the version of her he wished she were was standing just behind her right shoulder. She had learned to interpret him the way you learn to read weather, by reading the small signs rather than waiting for the storm. A daughter who could not walk without a carved crutch was a daughter whose marriage prospects were narrow. This was not a secret. This was simply a fact about the world they lived in, the world of 1893, of a merchant family of middling standing, of a country that was itself being renegotiated by forces larger than any single household. Mei Li had faced this fact before her father did. She had faced it honestly, which is to say she had looked at it without flinching and then decided it was not the most important thing about her and moved on to the next task. But her father had not moved on. Her father carried it the way he carried his debts, as something that needed to be solved, something that sat on a ledger somewhere and refused to balance. The morning of the arrangement, there had been a visitor. Mei Li had not been introduced to him. She had been, in a manner she had come to recognize very well, arranged out of the way. Her father had asked her at breakfast to sort the new delivery of thread samples in the silk room, which was work the young servant boy usually did, and which required her to be in the back of the house where the visitor would not see her. She had taken her tea, picked up her crutch, and gone to the silk room without expression, because she had learned long ago that expression was something you saved for when it could actually change something. She heard the voices through the wall, not every word but enough words. She heard the phrase foreign house. She heard the word interpreter. She heard her father's particular laugh, the one he used when he was performing confidence he did not feel. She heard numbers, though she could not make out what the numbers referred to. She counted threads. The visitor stayed for nearly 2 hours. When he left, her father called her to the front room, which he never did during business hours. She came on her crutch across the courtyard with its grey paving stones and its single plum tree that had not bloomed properly in 3 years. She came into the front room where her father stood with his hands clasped behind his back in the posture he used when he had already decided something and wanted to present it as settled. He spoke for about 4 minutes. He used words like opportunity and position and suitable arrangement. He explained that a British trading house operating out of Shanghai required a Chinese woman of education and good family who could serve as household interpreter and cultural advisor to a senior resident. He explained that he had given the matter careful thought. He explained that this was, in his view, a good outcome for her given her particular circumstances, and that he hoped she could see that. He did not ask if she agreed. He did not ask what she thought. He asked, at the end, whether she had any practical questions about the arrangements for her departure. She stood in the front room with her weight on her good leg and her crutch under her arm and looked at him. He looked slightly past her, at the wall behind her right shoulder, which is where the version of her he wished she were was apparently still standing. She said, "When do I leave?" He said, 2 weeks, perhaps 3. She said, "I understand." She went back to the silk room and sat on the wooden stool and did not count threads for a long time. She sat very still and looked at the bolt of red silk in front of her, at the way the light from the small window moved across it in the afternoon, making it seem almost alive, almost breathing. She had been here for 22 years. She had learned to read in this house, first the simple characters, then the more complex ones from her grandfather who had believed, against the common view of his time, that a girl with a good mind was worth educating. She had read every book in the house. She had taught herself a second dialect of spoken Chinese from a merchant who came twice a year, and who had not realized, apparently, that she was listening to his conversations with her father rather than simply sitting nearby being quiet. She had started learning English 3 years ago from a water-stained primer she had bought herself from a street bookseller with coins she had saved slowly over months from the household budget she managed. Her father did not know about the English. It had not been a decision to hide it from him, not exactly. It had simply been something she had done for herself, in the early mornings before the house was fully awake, sitting by the small window in her room with the primer open on her lap and a candle burning down beside her. English was something she had chosen. It belonged to her in a way that almost nothing else in her life did. She sat with the knowledge of the arrangement for the rest of the afternoon and all through the evening and most of the night. She lay in her bed in the dark and held the information the way you hold something heavy that you cannot put down, turning it slowly, feeling its weight from every angle. By the time the first gray light came through her window, she had made a decision that was not exactly acceptance but was something harder and more useful. She was going, that was certain, but she was not going as someone being sent away. She was going as someone who had decided to go, and there was a difference between those two things, a difference that mattered enormously even if it was invisible to everyone else, even if her father would never understand it. She thought about her grandfather. He had died when she was 11, a small man with enormous hands and a habit of humming while he worked. He had made her crutch. He had carved it from a branch of the old plum tree in the courtyard after the one the doctor had provided proved too heavy and gave her blisters. He had worked on it for 3 weeks, shaping it and smoothing it until it fit her exactly, until the top curve sat in her armpit as though it had been made for no other purpose, because it had been. He had given it to her without ceremony, just handed it to her one morning and said, "This one will last." It had lasted 11 years. The wood had darkened with use and the grip had worn smooth, and it had become as much a part of her physical self as her own arm. She was never without it. She did not experience it as something that marked her as lesser. She experienced it as a tool that her grandfather had made with care, and that care was in the wood itself, and she carried it with her everywhere. She was going to Shanghai. She was going to a British household she had never seen, to work for a family she had never met, in a city she had visited exactly once, when she was 9 years old, and which she remembered mainly as noise and salt air and more foreign faces than she had known existed. She thought about this for a long time. Then she got up, lit her candle, and opened her English primer to the page she had left off at, which was a section on formal greetings, and she read until the candle burned out and the daylight made it unnecessary. 2 weeks later, a servant came to help with the luggage. She had one trunk, the crutch, her books wrapped in cloth, a small jar of tea that her grandfather had sealed himself, pressed with the family seal, given to her the Christmas before he died, with a look she had not fully understood then. She understood it now. It was the look of someone giving you something they cannot come with you to explain. She stood in the courtyard beside the plum tree that had not bloomed properly in 3 years and looked at her father's house one more time. Her father stood in the doorway. He said something about the journey being safe, about writing when she arrived. He said he hoped she would make the most of the opportunity. He looked slightly past her at her right shoulder. She looked directly at him. She had his eyes, she knew. Everyone said so, dark and clear and difficult to read. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her. She wondered if he saw anything at all, or if she had always been too far to the side of his vision to come into proper focus. She did not hug him, he did not step forward. She turned and walked to the waiting carriage on her crutch, one steady step at a time, and she did not look back, and she was careful, extremely careful, to make sure that no one watching her could tell she wanted to. The road to Shanghai was 3 days. She sat by the carriage window and watched the landscape change, the flat water country of Suzhou giving way to the broader land near the coast, the cities growing more crowded and noisier as they went, the smells changing from mud and rice fields to something sharper, more mineral, the smell of a city that was actively remaking itself under pressure it did not fully understand yet. She held her grandfather's jar of tea on her lap for most of the journey. She did not open it. She was not ready to open it. She did not know when she would be, only that she would know when the time came. The carriage stopped at a river crossing on the second afternoon, and while they waited for the ferry she watched a woman on the bank washing cloth. The woman worked with her arms in the water up to the elbows, wringing and slapping the cloth against a flat stone, and she hummed while she worked, and she did not look up at the waiting carriages or the foreign faces or any of the rest of it. She just worked and hummed, and Mei Li watched her until the ferry came. She thought, that is someone who knows exactly what she is doing and why. She thought, I want to be that. I want to know exactly what I am doing and why. She opened her English primer. She read until it was too dark to see, and then she sat in the dark of the rocking carriage and ran through verb conjugations in her head like someone counting threads, like someone making sure everything is in its proper place before the work begins. Shanghai appeared on the 3rd morning like a rumor becoming real. She pressed her face to the window and looked at it. The skyline, the river so wide it seemed like a sea, the foreign buildings along the waterfront, thick-shouldered and certain of themselves in a way that local buildings were not. The boats on the water, hundreds of them, every size and shape, and the noise coming through the carriage window even before they reached the city itself, a low continuous roar that was not any single sound but all sounds combined into something that felt like pressure against the ears. She had been told that a man from the trading house would meet her at the city gate and take her to the residence. She had been told the senior resident's name, though she had heard it wrong the first time and the second version still felt strange in her mouth, the sounds landing in unfamiliar places. She had not been told what to expect. She had not been told anything practical about what the work would actually involve, or where she would sleep, or who else would be in the household, or whether the people she was going to would look at her the way her father's creditors looked at him, which was to say with the polite expression of people calculating what you are worth to them. She straightened her back. She adjusted her grip on the crutch. She watched Shanghai come toward her through the window, enormous and indifferent and absolutely unprepared for her. She had made a decision in the dark of her childhood bedroom, in the light of a burning down candle, with an English primer open on her lap. She had decided she was not going as someone being sent. She was going as herself, which meant going with everything she had learned in 22 years of watching and counting and reading in secret and understanding things that no one expected her to understand. The carriage slowed, the city closed around it, and Mei Li, daughter of a silk merchant who had traded her for cotton and debt forgiveness, sat very straight with her crutch in her hand and her grandfather's sealed tea jar on her lap and watched Shanghai open in front of her like the first page of a book she had been waiting a long time to read. She was ready. Not because she was unafraid, she was afraid. The fear was there in her chest, specific and cold, the way fear always is when it is honest. But she was ready anyway. And sometimes that is the only kind of ready that exists. The man who met her at the city gate was sweating through his collar. He introduced himself as Mr. Crane, a junior agent of the Caldwell trading house, and he spoke in a fast, thin English that she understood about 80% of, which she decided was sufficient. He was young, perhaps 24, with a face that was still working out whether it was going to be handsome, and had not yet reached a verdict. He looked at her with the expression she had expected, and had already decided to ignore, the particular expression of someone who has been sent to collect something, and has now discovered that what they were sent to collect is more complicated than what they were told. He looked at the crutch, he looked at the trunk being unloaded from the carriage, he looked at her face, which gave him nothing, because she had spent 22 years perfecting a face that gave nothing. He said, "Welcome to Shanghai, miss." She said, "Thank you." He said, "The carriage to the residence is just here." She said, "Good." He walked to the second carriage and held the door open, and she crossed the stones to it on her crutch, steady and unhurried, and he stood with the door held and did not look directly at her, which was fine, because she was not looking at him either. She was looking at Shanghai. The city moved past the carriage window in a way that was almost violent in its density. She had thought she was prepared for it. She had not been prepared for it. Suzhou was old and layered and familiar in its bones. Shanghai was something else entirely, a city that seemed to be happening faster than cities normally happened, that had grown outward and upward in a hurry and had not paused to decide what it was yet. There were streets that were entirely foreign, with foreign signs on foreign buildings and men in foreign clothes walking in the particular way of people who consider themselves to be in the right place. And then 2 streets away, local life ran its own parallel course, the noodle sellers and the cloth merchants and the children darting between ankles, a whole city that had simply absorbed the foreign presence the way water absorbs something dropped into it, closing back around it without becoming it. She watched all of it with the absolute focus she had used her whole life for watching, which was total and quiet, and left no room for whatever feeling was happening below the surface. The Caldwell Trading House residence sat on a street behind the main waterfront road, a building that was European in its shape, but had acquired over time a series of Chinese additions that suggested the people who had lived in it had gradually realized that certain practical accommodations were necessary. There was a covered walkway along the east side. There were paper lanterns still up from a festival several weeks past. The garden, which she could see through the gate as the carriage pulled up, had been planted in a half-English, half-local style that had clearly been the project of someone who could not fully decide between the two. Mr. Crane knocked, and the gate was opened by a Chinese manservant of about 40 who looked at Mei Li with a different expression than Mr. Crane had, an expression that was more curious than uncertain, the expression of someone who was genuinely interested to see what happened next. His name was Bao. She would learn this later. He would become the most useful person she knew in Shanghai, not because he told her things, but because he was always in the places where things were being said. The residence was substantial. 5 main rooms downstairs, a kitchen that smelled of both foreign bread and Chinese cooking at once, a study full of papers that made her fingers itch with the desire to read them. Upstairs, 4 bedrooms. She was shown to one of them, smaller than the others and looking onto the garden which she preferred. There was a window. There was light. She put her trunk in the corner and stood in the room for a moment with her hand on her crutch and felt the space around her for what it was, not home at all, but a place where things might become possible. Mr. Crane said from the doorway, "The senior resident is away until Thursday." She said, "Who is the senior resident?" He said, "Mr. George Ashford. He is the Duke's younger brother. You will have met letters about him." She had read those letters too. She had read everything that came into the household regarding the arrangement, including the letter that had come addressed to her father and that her father had read and then placed in his desk rather than sharing its contents with her. a small act of withholding that had amused her more than it had hurt her, because she had read it before he had. George Ashford was 31. He had been in Shanghai for 2 years. He managed the house's interests in silk and tea. He had studied at Oxford, which was a British university she had read about, and he was described in the correspondence as a reliable, careful man who found the cultural navigation of his position difficult and who would benefit from informed assistance. Reliable and careful were not exciting words, but they were good words. They were the words of someone who did not make sudden moves, who could be predicted, who would not create new problems while she was still learning how to manage the existing ones. She said to Mr. Crane, "Is there a library?" He looked slightly surprised. He said, "In the study there are shelves." She said, "May I use them?" He said, "I expect so, I'll ask." She unpacked her trunk that evening with Bao's assistance, which she accepted gracefully and without the performance of not needing it that she sometimes felt pressured to put on for people who expected it. Bao carried the heavier things and did not comment on the crutch, and did not treat her with the kind of exaggerated care that was its own form of condescension. He carried things, she directed. It was a functional arrangement, and it worked. She placed her books on the small shelf beside the window. She placed the jar of her grandfather's tea on the windowsill where the morning light would hit it. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the jar and felt the distance between this room and the silk room in Suzhou. Not in miles, but in the kind of distance that cannot be measured, the distance between the person you were and the person you are currently in the process of becoming. She opened her English primer and read for an hour. The next 2 days before George Ashford arrived were spent in a kind of careful reconnaissance. She walked every room she was permitted to walk in. She read what was available to read. She listened to the household sounds and began to understand the rhythms of the place. When food came and when it didn't, who came and went. What language was used in what context? Mr. Crane came by on the second day with a list of her duties written on good paper in a careful hand. Translation at meetings, correspondence review, explanation of local customs and practices, assistance with any formal entertaining that required cultural navigation. She read the list. She noted what was not on it. She noted that her English was not mentioned, which meant they did not know about it yet, which was a piece of information she had not decided what to do with. On Thursday, George Ashford came home. She was in the study, reading a report on local tea pricing that she had found on the desk and had been told she was welcome to look at, when she heard the gate open and the particular bustle of a senior person returning. She closed the report, put it back exactly where she had found it, and stood with her crutch to go to the main room and be introduced. He was not what she had pictured from the correspondence. The word reliable had made her picture someone round and steady and slightly dull, the way reliable things sometimes are. George Ashford was tall and slightly thin, and had a habit of moving his hands when he talked that gave him the look of someone conducting an orchestra that only he could hear. He had good eyes, brown and direct, and when he looked at her he did what very few people managed to do, which was to look at her face first. He said in careful and slightly incorrect Chinese, "I am glad you arrived safely." She replied in equally careful English, "Thank you, the journey was comfortable." He blinked, then he laughed, which was a good laugh, not a condescending one, more the laugh of someone who has been genuinely surprised by something. He said, "I was told you might know some English, I was told some." She said, "I know enough." He said clearly. They stood in the front room of the residence and looked at each other for a moment, sizing things up in the honest way that strangers do before the social requirements of politeness smooth everything back to the surface. She thought, he is nervous, actually, not of her specifically, but of the whole arrangement of getting it wrong. She recognized that nervousness. She had felt it herself coming in. She said, "Shall I explain what I know about the current pricing disputes at the Eastern Docks? I read the report on your desk." He said, "I said you were welcome to look at it." She said, "I know, I wasn't apologizing." That second blink again, the second surprised laugh, he said, "No, please tell me what you noticed." She told him. She spoke for about 12 minutes and he listened without interrupting, which was a quality she had not assumed she would find in him, and which she registered as significant. When she finished, he asked 2 questions, both of which were the right questions, which told her that whatever else he was actually paying attention to his work. The household settled into a rhythm over the following weeks. She attended meetings with local traders and interpreted, which she did well, in which she also used to observe how much the local traders understood of the foreign customs they were navigating, which was less than the foreign traders assumed and more than they let on. She began composing brief notes after each meeting for George Ashford's reference, summaries of what had been said, but also what she thought had been meant, the spaces between the words where the actual negotiating was happening. He read every note the same day she wrote it. He began adding questions in the margins in pencil. She answered in the margins in ink. Within a month they had developed a written conversation that ran alongside the spoken one, a second layer of understanding that was more precise than what was possible in real time, because in real time there were other people watching, and in the margins there were only the two of them. She did not think of this as friendship. She thought of it as an efficient working arrangement. She told herself this firmly on more than one occasion. The life of the residents had its own texture that she was learning to navigate. The other staff were 3 in number, Bao, who she had already assessed, a cook named Ping who had been with the household for years and who communicated her feelings about change primarily through the medium of what she did and did not choose to put on the dinner table, and a young girl called Lan who cleaned and who was badly homesick and who Mei Li sometimes caught crying in the linen room. She did not tell Lan that it would get easier. She did not know if that was true, and she did not say things she did not know to be true. She brought her tea one afternoon and sat with her for a little while and did not make her talk, because sometimes not being alone is enough without any words needing to be involved. Bao noticed he did not comment. He simply, the following week, made sure that Lan's day off coincided with a local market day that the girl had mentioned missing from home. He arranged this quietly and did not take credit for it, which was how she knew he was the kind of person who actually understood how things worked. She was settling into something, not comfort exactly, not yet, but the feeling of a place beginning to make sense, of knowing where things were and what they meant, of understanding the rules well enough to begin to work within them. One evening in the 3rd week, she sat at the small desk in her room after dinner and wrote a letter home. It was the first one. Her father had asked her to write when she arrived. She had arrived 3 weeks ago. She had not written because she had not yet decided what to say. She wrote that she had arrived safely. She wrote that the residence was comfortable and the work suited her abilities. She wrote 3 paragraphs of this kind of factual, careful information, the kind of letter that told everything that could be counted and nothing that could not. At the end she wrote, "The plum tree will bloom again this year. I think perhaps it just needed a different spring." She read the last sentence after she had written it and was not sure where it had come from. She folded the letter anyway and sealed it and put it with the outgoing correspondence and did not think about it again. That night she dreamed of the silk room in Suzhou, the bolts of fabric and the small window and the light moving across the red silk in the afternoon. She woke at 4 in the morning and the room was dark, and the jar of tea on the windowsill caught the moonlight and glowed faintly. She lay awake and listened to Shanghai happening outside the window. The city never fully slept. There was always some sound, some sign of it moving and rearranging itself and negotiating with its own contradictions. She lay and listened to it and thought about the woman she had seen at the river crossing, the one who washed cloth and hummed and did not look up. She thought, "I am starting to know what I am doing." She thought, "I am not yet sure why." She thought, "That is acceptable, the why will come. It usually does if you keep working." She got up at 5, lit her candle, and opened her English primer to a new section she had not reached before. It was about the formal language of business correspondence, the particular phrases that meant specific things in a legal or commercial context. She read each phrase carefully, tested the meaning, made small notes in the margin. By 6 o'clock she knew 12 new things. By the time the household woke and the smell of breakfast came through the floorboards, she was already at her desk composing her first original English letter, addressed to a local tea supplier on behalf of the Caldwell Trading House, from her own drafting rather than from dictation. She read it through once. Then she went downstairs and placed it on George Ashford's desk with her other morning notes. In the pile he always looked at first, and she went to breakfast and ate and said nothing about it. He came to find her an hour later. He held the letter in one hand. He had the expression of someone who has just learned something that requires him to recalibrate what he thought he knew. He said, "Did you write this yourself?" She said, "Yes." He said, "It is very good." She said, "I know. I would like to write all the routine correspondence. It will free your time for the work that requires your direct attention. He looked at the letter again. He said, "Yes, all right, yes." She said, "Thank you." She went back to her room to retrieve the notes for the afternoon meeting and did not let him see that she was pleased. Pleased was private. Pleased was something she kept for herself, for the moments when no one was watching, which were few enough that she had learned to value them. She sat on her bed for 30 seconds. She allowed herself to be pleased. Then she went to work. The Duke arrived on a Tuesday without warning, which was the kind of thing that only people with a great deal of power did, because only people with a great deal of power were accustomed to the world rearranging itself around their schedule. His name was Edmund Ashford. He held the title of Viscount, which was a rank below Duke but still far enough above ordinary life that it might as well have been a different country. He had come to Shanghai not to visit his brother's household, but to oversee a business matter that had become more complicated than the letters had conveyed, which was another thing that only happened when the people writing the letters had been hoping the problem would resolve itself before someone of importance had to personally become involved. It had not resolved itself. Mei Li knew he was coming before George Ashford did. She had intercepted, with complete authorization, a letter from the trading house's administrative office in Hong Kong that referenced the Viscount's travel arrangements. She had placed this letter on George Ashford's desk with a small note in the margin that said, "Your brother arrives Tuesday by the Northern Road." George had read it at breakfast and gone slightly pale in a way that was interesting to observe. She had watched him for the rest of the day as he moved through the house in the particular way of someone whose older brother is coming and who has suddenly become aware of everything in the house that is not quite as it should be. He straightened papers on his desk. He spoke to Ping about the kitchen. He walked through the garden twice, which he never did. He asked Bao if the front room looked presentable, which was not a question he had ever asked before. She said nothing about any of this. It was not her business. But she noted it the way she noted everything, and she filed it in the part of her mind she used for understanding what people were actually like when the formal requirements of their position were temporarily set aside. Tuesday came. She was, as her father had once arranged her, in the back of the house. This time it was the study rather than the silk room, and this time she was there because the study was where she worked in the mornings, not because someone had placed her there to keep her out of sight. The distinction mattered to her. She heard the gate. She heard the sound of more than one carriage, which meant staff and luggage as well as the man himself. She heard George Ashford's voice, louder and slightly more formal than usual, the voice of someone performing being relaxed. She heard another voice, deeper and slower, with the quality of someone who was not performing anything in particular. She continued working. Bao came to the study door about 20 minutes later and said, in the careful way he had of delivering information, "The Viscount is asking about the household arrangement. He would like to meet everyone." She closed the document she was reading. She straightened the pages. She took her crutch from where it leaned against the desk and stood, and she took the single moment she allowed herself in these situations to settle, to become exactly who she intended to be and not anything else. She walked from the study to the front room. He was standing at the window when she entered. He turned when he heard her. He was tall, taller than his brother, and had the kind of build that comes not from deliberate physical work, but from years of outdoor activity taken for granted, someone who had ridden horses since childhood and walked long distances without thinking about it, and whose body had simply become what those habits made it. His coat was good. His hands were working hands despite the coat, and one of them, the right, lacked 2 fingers from somewhere below the knuckle, an absence he wore without apparent self-consciousness, as simply a fact about his hand the way her leg was a fact about her body. She noticed his hands first, which was not what people usually noticed first about a duke. He noticed her face first, which was not what people usually noticed first about her. He said, in the kind of English that did not have to try because it had never been taught anything different, "You are Miss Yang." She said, "I am." He said, "My brother speaks highly of your work." She said, "He has been kind enough to say so." He said, "The letter you drafted for the Eastern Dock suppliers resolved a misunderstanding we have been trying to correct for 6 weeks. I read it in Hong Kong." She had not known that letter had gone to Hong Kong. She considered this piece of information and filed it. She said, "I am glad it was useful." He said, "More than useful, it was precisely right." She looked at him, he looked at her. There was a moment that was not long but was full in the way that some moments are, the way a room can be full even when it contains only two people. George came in from the kitchen with the particular expression of someone who had been hoping to control the introduction and had missed it by 30 seconds. He said something about tea. Everyone moved toward chairs. She sat, she held her crutch beside her, and arranged herself with the particular ease she had developed over years of being in rooms where her body was of interest to other people. The ease of someone who has decided that her way of sitting in a chair is simply her way of sitting in a chair, and does not require management or apology. Edmund Ashford did not look at the crutch. He looked at the window, and then at the garden, and then he asked her a question about the tea pricing reports that was not a small-talk question. It was a real question, the kind with a specific answer that required actual knowledge. She gave him the specific answer. He listened the way his brother listened completely, without filling the silence with his own thoughts while she was still speaking. It was a family trait, apparently. She found herself wondering who had taught them this, or whether some people simply arrived in the world with the capacity to actually listen. The afternoon went on. She stayed in the room for the practical reason that she was the most informed person in it regarding the commercial matters being discussed, and leaving would have been a failure of function rather than a social grace. She spoke when she knew something relevant. She did not speak otherwise. She drank her tea and watched the two brothers and learned everything she could about the relationship between them, which was the relationship of two people who respected each other, without having ever fully resolved the fact that one of them was born 12 minutes earlier, and this had determined the entire shape of both their lives. George was the careful one, Edmund was the one who decided. She thought in another life those roles might have been reversed. She thought, in this particular life neither of them gets to choose. She had no interest in feeling sorry for men with titles, but she was interested in people who were constrained by things outside their choosing, because that was a condition she had some personal experience with. The household dinner that evening was the first formal meal since Edmund's arrival, and Ping had interpreted the occasion correctly, which is to say she had produced an enormous quantity of excellent food, and arranged it in a way that honored both the foreign and the local without appearing to try too hard in either direction. Ping's genius was in that specific thing, the absence of effort in the presentation of things that had required enormous effort. Mei Li sat at the dinner table. She had not been asked to sit at the dinner table for previous formal occasions, which had been smaller affairs. She had been asked tonight because George Ashford had simply assumed she would be there, which she had noticed, and which she was not sure how to interpret. She sat and ate and listened and spoke when it was appropriate to speak. There were 3 other British guests at the table. 2 of them were business associates of the trading house, and the third was a man called Hollies, wide-faced and self-certain, who was stationed in Shanghai and had opinions about everything and the particular gift of expressing all of his opinions in a tone that suggested he had already been agreed with. Hollies looked at her across the table with the look she knew, the kind that categorizes before it understands, that places things in their boxes before examining what they actually are. He said to the table generally, but in the direction of George Ashford, which was the way people said things they wanted heard but not attributed. Interesting household arrangement. The table did not quite go silent, but there was a pause in the way that tables pause when something has been said that everyone has heard and everyone is deciding whether to address. Edmund Ashford said, pleasantly and without any notable change in tone, Miss Yang has corrected a 6-week correspondence problem in a single letter. If you have a more interesting arrangement to suggest, Hollies, I am happy to hear it. Hollies laughed, the laugh of a man who has decided the comment was a joke. He said, quite right, quite right. The dinner resumed. Mei Li looked at her soup bowl. She counted the blue-painted fish around its rim. There were 11. She had already known there were 11, because she had counted them 3 times before during previous meals. But counting them again gave her hands something to do and her eyes somewhere to go, while the inside of her chest ran its own separate process that she was not going to let anyone see. She was not going to be grateful. Being grateful for basic decency was a trap she had decided long ago not to fall into. Decency was the minimum requirement of civilization, not a gift. But she had noticed. After dinner, when the guests had moved to the front room for whatever the British did after dinner, which she had observed was primarily drinking and talking about the same things they had talked about at dinner, but at greater volume, she went to the garden. It was dark by then. The lanterns from the old festival cast a warm yellow light over the paths and the plants that had been allowed to grow slightly wild on the western wall. She stood in that light with her crutch and breathed the air, which smelled of the plants and the distant river and the cooking smells from neighboring houses. She heard the garden door behind her. She did not turn. She knew from the sound of the step that it was not George. Edmund Ashford came and stood a few feet away, not beside her but not far from her, and he looked at the lanterns rather than at her, which she interpreted as a deliberate courtesy. He said, "I am in Shanghai until the end of the month." She said, "Yes, the dark matter will take at least 3 weeks if the parties are efficient." He said, "They won't be." She said, "No." He said, "I may need your interpretation assistance during the formal meetings, if you are willing." She said, "That is what I am here for." He said, "Yes, and more than that I think from what George tells me." She did not respond to that. She let the sentence sit, which she was very good at doing. After a moment he said, "I apologize for Holly's this evening." She said, "You don't need to apologize for someone else's behavior." He said, "I know, I wanted to say it anyway." She looked at the lanterns. She thought about what to do with that. She thought, this is a man who says things not because they are required but because they seem to him to be right. That is worth noting. She said, "The garden needs attention on the west wall." He looked at the west wall, which was covered in something that had grown past the point of intention and into the territory of simply growing. He said, "It does." She said, "If I arrange for someone to work on it, the light will come through better in the morning." He said, "Please." She said, "Good night, my lord." He said, "Good night, Miss Yang." She walked back to the house on her crutch through the lantern light and did not look back, because looking back was a habit she was trying to correct in herself, the habit of turning around to check whether what had just happened was real. It was real, she did not need to check. 3 days later, the first formal meeting with the dock suppliers took place at the trading house offices. There were 11 men in the room, 9 of them local traders and 2 of them from the Caldwell house. She was the only woman. She was also, she was fairly certain, the only person in the room who fully understood everything that was being said in both languages, which was an unusual position to be in and one she had decided in advance to treat as an advantage. She sat to Edmund Ashford's right and slightly behind him, at a small side table with paper and a pen, because that was where interpreters sat. She interpreted clearly and precisely. She also paid attention to every hesitation, every pause, every glance between the local traders that indicated disagreement or negotiation happening beneath the surface of the spoken words. In the margins of her notes, she recorded these observations in small characters that no one else at the table could read. After the meeting, walking back to the residence, Edmund Ashford said, "You noted something at the 3rd hour, when Chen Wei was speaking about the storage agreements." She said he was not speaking for himself, he was speaking for someone who was not in the room. Someone who has final authority over the Eastern dock terms, but who is not ready to be known as having that authority. He said, "How could you tell?" She said, "He used the plural of a specific character that in that context means consultation rather than decision," and his eyes went to the door twice. He said, "I would not have known that." She said, "That is why I am here." He looked at her, she looked at the street ahead of them. Bao was 3 steps behind with the documents. He said, "Yes, it is." That evening she wrote her notes in full and left them on his desk. She went to her room and sat by the window and looked at the jar of tea in the last of the daylight. It sat sealed and patient and familiar. She thought, "I am doing what I came here to do." She thought, "I am more than what was put in a ledger." She thought, "My grandfather knew that." She put her hand on the jar for a moment, not opening it, just touching it. Then she opened her primer to the next page and kept going. The dock negotiations were supposed to take 3 weeks. They took 5. Every day she sat at the side table with her pen and her paper and her 2 languages and her margin notes that no one else could read. And every day the thing that was actually happening in the room was slightly different from the thing that appeared to be happening. And every day she translated the surface accurately and recorded the depth privately, and brought both to Edmund Ashford at the end of the session. He read everything, he asked good questions, he adapted. This was not common in men with his title and his authority, at least in her experience, which was admittedly not vast, but was more than it should have been for someone of her age and position, because people who are underestimated hear more than people who are taken seriously. She had spent 22 years hearing things that were not meant for her, and what she had learned was that people with power tended to stop listening once they had enough of it to believe they already knew what was going to be said. Edmund Ashford still listened. She found herself wondering how long he had managed to keep that quality and how much effort it had cost him. In the second week of the negotiations, something changed in the room. It was a Thursday. The senior local trader, a man named Kao, had brought his eldest son to observe. The son was perhaps 19, educated, clearly nervous, and had the look of someone who had been brought to watch his father's power and was not certain he was comfortable with what he was seeing. He sat along the wall with the junior staff and said nothing, but his eyes moved around the room in the way of someone who was taking everything in. Kao himself was a different kind of difficult than the previous sessions. He was slower, more deliberate. He was making the session long on purpose. She could feel it in the rhythm of the speaking, in the way he paused before every major claim and let the pause breathe until it was just past comfortable. She interpreted all of it faithfully. In the margin of her notes she wrote, "He is not here to finalize. He is here to make the Ashford party feel they have waited long enough that they will be grateful for any conclusion. The son is being shown what patience in commerce looks like." She passed the note to Edmund's left hand under the side of the table. Not a dramatic move, not a hidden one either, simply a movement that blended into the natural motion of the session. He read it without looking down. She had observed this ability of his before, the ability to receive information while maintaining the outward presentation of someone listening to something else entirely. After the session, walking back along the waterfront road, he said, "How long will he maintain this pace?" She said, "Until he believes the advantage he is accumulating is worth what it is costing him in time. He has other commitments on the dock. He cannot afford to draw this out past the end of the month." He said, "You are certain?" She said, "Not of everything, of that reasonably so." He said, "All right, what do we do?" She said, "Nothing. We continue as we are, which is to say calmly and without appearing to notice that he is doing what he is doing. The moment he believes we are aware of his tactic, the tactic changes and we lose the knowledge of it. As long as he does not know that we know, he will stay predictable." He said, "And if the month ends without resolution?" She said, "It will not. Kao has a contract with the Northern Rail Company that cannot move without a dock agreement. The deadline is real." He said, "How do you know about the rail contract?" She said, "Bao knows someone in the Northern office." He looked at her. She looked at the waterfront, at the boats in the brown river, and the enormous, unremarkable sky. He said, "Is there anything happening in this city that you are not aware of?" She said, "Certainly, but I try to keep the number small." He laughed, the real laugh, not the social one. She was becoming able to tell the difference. The social laugh was shorter and higher. The real one was slower and came from further down. She did not allow herself to notice this with any particular attention. She noted it the way she noted everything, filed it in the appropriate place, and kept walking. The fifth week began with an unexpected development. George Ashford had been conducting his own negotiations during this period, smaller matters relating to the house's tea interests, and one morning at breakfast, he arrived at the table with the particular look of someone who has been up since before the light, and has spent that time in the company of an unpleasant realization. He said to Edmund, "The Suzhou supply chain has a problem." Edmund said, "What kind of problem?" George said, "The quality problem we thought we corrected last year has not been corrected. It has been hidden. The reports we were sent were written to conceal the variance, not to address it." There was a silence at the breakfast table. She said, "Which supplier?" George looked at her. He said the name. It was not her father's name, but it was a name she recognized from the ledger she had read in her father's house, the name of a man who had business dealings with her father, who had been in the front room twice that she could recall, who had a particular way of sitting in a chair that made him seem larger than he was. She said, "I know him. He is known for managing appearances rather than managing problems. He has done this before with a thread supplier in Hangzhou. The supplier complained, but by the time the complaint reached the relevant party, the documentation had been rearranged enough that nothing conclusive could be proved. George said, "How do you know that?" She said, "I read and I listen, and people assume I am doing neither." He absorbed this. He said, "Can we prove the current problem?" She said, "Do you have the original sample reports from last year?" He said, "In the files, yes." She said, "And the reports you received this year that showed the correction?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Let me look at both sets." He brought them to her after breakfast. She spread them on the study table and spent most of the morning working through them in the careful, systematic way her grandfather had taught her to work through difficult things, one thread at a time, following each one to its end before picking up the next. By afternoon she had found 4 discrepancies, not in the numbers, which were too carefully managed to show the problem directly, but in the language. The same report writer using slightly different terms for the same conditions. A shift in the vocabulary that was small enough to be explained away as a change in style but was large enough, when you laid all the reports side by side and read them one after another, to suggest that 2 different sets of conditions were being described, one in the original reports and one in the later ones, using the same words but meaning different things. She brought her notes to George. She explained what she had found and why she thought it mattered. He said, "This is very good, I would not have seen this." She said, "You are looking at numbers, the problem is in the words." He said, "I'll send this to Edmund." She said, "Send him my notes directly. I have written them to be read by someone making a decision, not by someone relaying information to someone making a decision. An extra step will slow things down." He looked at her notes. He said, "Yes, all right." Edmund received the notes that evening. The following morning he came to the study before breakfast, which she had not expected. She was at her desk with tea and an open primer and her hair not yet fully arranged, which was the most informally he had ever found her. She did not reach for pins or apologize. She looked at him and waited. He said, "The 4 points, walk me through them." She walked him through them. He listened, he asked questions. They sat across the study table from each other in the early morning light that came through the east window, the light that had just cleared the garden wall, and they worked through the problem together in the focused, unsentimental way of 2 people who are both actually interested in solving it. Somewhere in the middle of this, the breakfast bell rang and neither of them moved. Bao appeared in the doorway about 20 minutes later, took in the scene and withdrew without speaking. He came back with a tea tray, set it on the side table and left again. This was Bao understanding a situation and responding to it practically, which was what Bao always did. She poured tea without being asked. She handed a cup to Edmund without ceremony, the way you hand something to someone you are in the middle of working with, and he took it without ceremony, and they kept working. Later she would think about that moment, not because it was remarkable in itself, the giving and taking of a cup of tea, but because of the quality of ordinary it had, the way it had happened without any of the small performances that usually surrounded such things between people of their respective positions. It had simply been, "Here is tea," and "Thank you," and then the work continued. That was the quality she would come to understand was the most unusual thing about him. Not the title, not the intelligence, not even the listening. The quality of doing ordinary things, as though they did not need to be weighted with any meaning beyond what they were. She had not met many people who could do that. In her experience, when people were very aware of a difference between themselves and another person, they either made the difference enormous or they made a performance of ignoring it, and both responses were exhausting in different ways. He just poured his own second cup of tea and kept asking questions about the discrepancies in the reports. She answered all of them. By 9 in the morning, they had a course of action. She wrote it out in a clean document, a formal letter to the Suzhou supplier requesting specific documentation within a set time frame, with particular references to the 4 discrepancies framed in the measured and precisely worded language of a party that knows exactly what it is looking at, and is giving the other party an opportunity to explain it before the conversation becomes something more formal. Edmund read the letter. He said, "This is right." She said, "Yes, I think so." He said, "You are very certain of yourself for someone who has been in Shanghai for 8 weeks. She said, "I am certain of the things I know. I am less certain of the things I don't know yet. I am trying to reduce the second category." He said, "And how is that going?" She said, "Faster than I expected." He said, "I can see that." The letter went out that afternoon. The Suzhou supplier responded in 4 days, which was 2 days faster than she had predicted, which she took as an indication that the discrepancies had been more obvious from the inside than they appeared from the outside, and that the supplier had been hoping the Caldwell house would not look closely enough to find them, and had now received confirmation that they had. She wrote a new set of notes based on the response and left them on Edmund's desk. He read them that evening. He added a note in pencil at the bottom. It said, "The third point, what do you think he was protecting?" She took the paper back to her room and sat with it and thought for a while. Then she wrote, "Himself." The first year of the problem was not his doing. He inherited the variance from the previous manager, but he chose concealment over correction, and he has been protecting that choice ever since. She returned the paper to his desk. In the morning there was another pencil note. It said, "That is a more generous reading than the situation warrants." She wrote back, "Perhaps, but if we want the correct behavior in the future, we need to understand the reasoning that produced the incorrect behavior in the past. Punishment without understanding tends to produce better hiding rather than better conduct." He read this at breakfast. She was eating and not looking at him, and he said, across the table, not looking up from the paper, "You should have studied law." George looked between them. He said nothing. He ate his eggs. She said, "I studied everything I could find." He looked up from the paper. He said, "Yes, I can see that too." The rest of the week was ordinary work, which is to say it was full and demanding and important, and the kind of thing that most people did not notice was happening while it happened, but which added up to things that mattered. She wrote 11 letters. She attended 3 meetings. She corrected a translation error in a legal contract that would have created a significant misunderstanding about land rights. She helped Lan with a letter home. She spent an afternoon in the study cross-referencing 3 years of tea-quality reports because she had become curious about a pattern, and curiosity, in her experience, was worth following wherever it went. She was not unhappy. That was worth noting. She was not happy exactly, not yet, not in the simple, full way she associated with the word, but she was something. She was present and useful and thinking, and those 3 things together felt more like life than most of what she had had access to before. She sat by the window each evening with the jar of tea on the sill and watched the light change and thought about what she was building here, what the shape of it was, what it might become. She thought, "A month ago I did not know this place existed." She thought, "A month ago, neither did it know I existed." She thought, "We are figuring each other out." She opened her primer to the next section. There were still many pages left. There were always more pages. She had found, in 22 years of reading, that this was the one entirely reliable thing, that there were always more pages, and that the end was never quite where you thought it would be, and that the best approach was to simply keep going and find out. She kept going. The dinner party was George Ashford's idea, which meant it was also his mistake to own. He had invited 12 people to the residence on a Friday evening to mark what he called the successful resolution of the dock negotiations, which had finally concluded in a way favorable to the Caldwell house, and also to mark, though he did not say this directly, his brother's continued presence in Shanghai. Edmund's original 2-week visit had extended to 5 weeks. No one had formally acknowledged this extension or explained it. The extension simply was. 12 people came. 7 were British, from various positions in the foreign quarter. 4 were Chinese traders or officials who had been part of the negotiations, and whose inclusion was a political courtesy more than a social one. 1 was a French merchant named Bertrand, who was neither British nor Chinese, and who appeared to have been invited because he was known to tell very good stories, and George felt stories would be needed to carry the evening. Mei Li was included without discussion, which is the way George Ashford had begun to include her in household matters, as a simple and obvious thing rather than a question requiring a decision. She had noted this shift. She had not commented on it. She dressed for the dinner with the particular care she applied to situations where she knew she would be observed not as a function, but as a person, which was to say more carefully than usual, and with the kind of deliberateness that was almost its own form of armor. She chose the dark green dress she had bought from a shop near the waterfront 3 weeks earlier, a dress that was neither fully local nor fully foreign in its cut, but occupied a space between the two that was, she had decided, exactly where she intended to occupy her position in this household. She came downstairs. Edmund Ashford was in the front room already, speaking with two of the early arriving British guests. He looked up when she entered. Something in his expression shifted slightly, some small adjustment that was too quick and too contained to read with certainty, but which she registered the way she registered all small adjustments, as data that might become significant later. He said nothing, continued his conversation. She moved to the room and spoke to the Chinese traders, who were standing in the slight self-contained way of people who are guests in a space that was designed for other people, and who have decided to be gracious about it. She spoke in their shared language, and the quality of the conversation changed immediately, the particular relaxation that happens when people stop navigating and start simply talking. The dinner table was arranged with 10 years of Ping's judgment about how these occasions should run, which meant the food appeared in a sequence that managed to feed everyone generously without the evening becoming exclusively about food, and the balance between the Chinese and foreign dishes was managed with such seamless confidence that several of the foreign guests made complimentary noises without appearing to notice that half of what they were eating was not what they usually ate. Ping accepted no compliments. Ping was not at the table. Ping received the compliments through bow and registered them with the expression of someone who had always known and was glad others were catching up. Mei Li sat between one of the British officials, a man named Graham with the solid, weathered quality of someone who had been in Asia long enough to have stopped being shocked by it, and the senior Chinese trader, old Keo's nephew, a younger man called Wei, who was more comfortable in the room than his uncle had been but was still navigating its currents. Graham asked her with genuine interest rather than performance, "How long have you been with the Caldwell house?" She said, 2 months. He looked surprised. He said, "I would have thought longer." She said, "Why?" He said, "You seem very settled in it." She said, "I try to be useful quickly. It shortens the adjustment period." He laughed in the way of someone who has said something he recognizes as a significant understatement. Wei on her other side leaned slightly toward her and said, quietly in their shared language, "The Viscount. He is the type who stays or the type who visits." She said, "I don't know yet." He said, "Does he know what he is?" She said, "That is the question he has not answered." Wei considered this. He said, "Interesting household." She said, "All households are interesting if you look at them long enough." He said, "You look very closely." She said, "That is my job." He gave her the small smile of someone who has understood a second meaning alongside the first. The evening moved in the particular rhythm of dinners, where the food is good, and the wine is present, and the mix of people is just interesting enough that conversation does not require too much effort. Bertrand, the French merchant, told the story he was known for about a misunderstanding in Morocco involving 3 camels and a diplomatic pouch, and told it in a mixture of French and English that somehow worked, and everyone at the table laughed, including her, because it was actually funny. Edmund, sitting at the head of the table, laughed too. She looked at him at that moment, and he was already looking down the table at her, at the laughter, with the expression of someone who has just found something they were not expecting to find and is not yet sure what to do about it. She looked back at her plate. Then Holly spoke. He was across the table and 3 seats to her left, and he had been drinking in the dedicated way of a man working toward a conclusion, and the conclusion arrived in the form of a statement addressed to the table generally and no one specifically, which was the method he favored. He said, "Remarkable thing, isn't it, the degree to which this part of the world has become so mixed up with the other." The table absorbed this. Several people continued their conversations. Graham, beside her, went slightly still. Holly's continued, "I mean to say, sitting here, you would hardly know which world you were in." She counted the fish on her plate's border. There were 8. She had not previously examined this plate's border. She was examining it now with a precision that had nothing to do with fish. Holly said, "Nothing against it, mind you, nothing at all. Charming, really." She looked up from the plate. She looked at Holly's. She held his gaze in the particular way she had learned to hold the gazes of men who expected her to look away, the way that was not aggressive and not submissive and simply refused to do what it was expected to do. She said, in the same pleasant tone Holly's had been using, "You have been stationed in Shanghai for how long, Mr. Holly's?" He said, 4 years. She said, "And in those 4 years, Have you learned any of the local language? He said, a few phrases, enough to manage. She said, and have you read any of the local history? The commercial treaties, perhaps, or the cultural texts? He said, well, not in any formal sense. She said, I see. So in 4 years, your understanding of this part of the world is primarily through observation from a particular position rather than through, shall we say, the kind of deep familiarity that comes from study or from having lived it rather than been stationed in it. She said this with perfect pleasantness, with the smile she had perfected over 22 years, the smile that meant nothing at all. The table had gone quiet in the way that dinner tables go quiet when something real is being said in a social setting, where real things are not supposed to arrive without warning. Hollis said quite. She said, thank you for clarifying. I find it helps to understand the basis of observations before evaluating them. She turned back to Graham and asked him about a trade route he had mentioned earlier, and the conversation resumed, and Hollis reached for his glass, and somewhere at the head of the table she heard, without looking, the very quiet sound of Edmund Ashford setting down his fork. After dinner she stood in the garden. The lanterns were still up. The west wall had been attended to and the light came through better now, the way she had said it would. She stood in that better light and breathed. The dinner had been fine, the table had been fine, she was fine. She performed a brief internal survey and confirmed all of these things as accurate. She heard the door. She knew the step. She said, without turning, you don't need to check on me. He said, coming to stand a few feet away, I know. I came out here because Bertrand is telling the Morocco story again for people who missed it the first time, and I have heard it 3 times tonight. She said, it is a good story. He said, it is a very good story. It is still a story I have now heard 3 times. She allowed a small laugh. He stood in the lantern light and she stood in the lantern light and the garden was quiet. He said, you handled Hollis well. She said, I didn't handle him, I asked him questions. He said, yes, that is what I mean. She said, questions are the most honest instrument there is. You can't accuse someone of aggression for asking them something. But the answer and the absence of an answer both tell you everything. He said, where did you learn that? She said, reading, and watching people in rooms where they did not think I was paying attention. He said, and were you always paying attention? She said, always. He said, I'll remember that. She said, most people think they will and then forget. He said, I won't. She looked at the lanterns, they swayed slightly in the evening air. She said, your brother is uncomfortable when you are here. He said, I know I stay too long, but the work requires it. She said, that is not why he is uncomfortable. A pause, the lanterns moved. He said, no, you're right. She said, he is good at his work, he does not need to be supervised. He said, I know that, I'm not here to supervise him. She said, he doesn't know that. He was quiet for a moment. He said, is this you telling me something you think I should hear or you asking me something indirectly? She said, both, that is usually what talking is. He said, yes, that is usually what talking is. They stood in the garden for a little while longer and did not say anything that required words, which was also something she had learned to value in a person, the capacity to be in a space with someone else without filling it with noise. She said good night and went inside. She lay awake for a while after and looked at the ceiling and ran through the evening as she always did, cataloging what had happened and what had been said and what it meant, the systematic processing that helped her move information from the immediate to the understood. She thought about Hollis and the fish on the plate and the smile that meant nothing at all. She thought about Graham's genuine interest and Way's quiet amusement and Bertrand's camels. She thought about the lanterns and the garden, and the person standing in it who had said I won't in the tone of someone who was making a statement rather than a promise. She thought about the difference between those two things. A statement is a description of what is. A promise is an intention about what will be. The distinction matters. The statement says, this is how I am. The promise says, this is what I will do about it. He had said I won't, which was a statement about his nature rather than a commitment to any particular act, which was actually a more honest thing to say. She thought about that for a while. She opened her primer in the dark by memory, running her fingers over the pages she already knew, and fell asleep in the middle of a sentence about the subjunctive tense. She woke before dawn, as she always did, and went to the window. The jar of tea sat on the sill. The city was beginning its early sounds, the first movements of a city getting ready for another day of being itself. She held the jar for a moment. She thought of her grandfather's hands making the seal. She thought of the smell of the old silk room and the plum tree that had not bloomed in 3 years, and the distance between there and here, which was not measured in miles. She put the jar down. She lit her candle. She kept going. Edmund Ashford had been scheduled to leave Shanghai on a Thursday. By Thursday he had rescheduled for the following week, citing the Suzhou supplier matter, which was still technically unresolved in a way that required someone of authority to remain present. She wrote the documents that kept this technically unresolved. She did not examine her own reasons for doing so with any particular attention. She wrote the documents. The following week passed. He rescheduled again. This time the reason was a new development in the Northern Tea contracts, which was also technically true, because she had found the development while cross-referencing the reports she had been working through for 3 weeks, and she had brought it to his attention, and it had been significant enough to warrant his continued presence. She had brought it to his attention on a Monday morning. She had known about it since Saturday. She examined this gap in her mind for a moment, and then put it somewhere and moved on. The household had settled into a shape that included him now, the way a room settles around a piece of furniture that was not there before, and then gradually becomes impossible to imagine without. George was still slightly stiff in his presence, but had begun to relax around the edges, particularly in the evenings when they sat in the front room after dinner, and George talked about his work in the way he could not talk about it when Edmund was in a formal mode, and Edmund listened in the way he listened, which was completely and without making the other person feel small for needing to speak. She sat at the edge of these evenings with her notes or her primer, and was present without being in the foreground, which was a position she had occupied so much of her life that it fit her like clothing worn until it becomes skin. But these evenings were different from what she had known before. Before, being at the edge of a room meant being outside it. Here she was at the edge and inside it at the same time, which was an unusual condition. On a Wednesday, 3 weeks into what had become a long visit, Edmund found her at her desk in the study at an hour when she was not usually there. She had been unable to sleep, and had come down at 2 in the morning to work, which she did sometimes when the mind would not stop, when it was easier to give it something real to do than to lie in the dark waiting for it to tire. He was there already. He was sitting at the far end of the study table with a letter in his hand and the lamp low, and he did not look up immediately when she came in, which meant either that he had not heard her or that he was somewhere inside the letter, and the outside world was temporarily suspended. She stopped in the doorway. After a moment he looked up. He said, "Come in." She said, "I did not mean to disturb you." He said, "You didn't come in." She came in. She went to her desk. She set her notes on the desk and arranged them and picked up her pen, and for a while they worked in the same room in the low lamplight and the quiet of the house at 2 in the morning, which had a different quality than the quiet of any other hour. She worked through the contract comparison she had brought down with her. He read whatever he was reading, and then set it aside and began writing something, and then stopped and sat looking at the window, which was dark, and there was nothing in it except the faint reflection of the room itself. He said, "Do you miss Suzhou?" She said, "I miss specific things about it." He said, "Which things?" She said, "My grandfather's workroom, the smell of the silk, the sound the courtyard made after rain." She paused. She said, "The plum tree." He said, "And your family?" She said, "Yes, in the way you miss something you could not have had differently." He absorbed this. He said, "That is a precise kind of missing." She said, "I am a precise kind of person." He said, "Yes." A period of quiet. Outside the study window the city made its night sounds, diminished but present. She said, "The letter." He said, "Yes." She said, "It is from England." He said, "From my father. He is unwell, not critically, but the word is that this winter will be harder than the last." She said, "I am sorry." He said, "I am needed there. I have been needed there for 6 weeks, actually." She said nothing. She looked at her contract comparison. He said, I have been not going because there is work here that requires my attention, which is true, and because I find I think more clearly when I know where you are. She looked up from the paper. He was looking at the dark window. His face had the expression of a man who has said something out loud that he had previously only acknowledged to himself, and who is not sure now whether the saying of it was a mistake or something else entirely. She said, You should not have said that. He said, I know. She said, It complicates things. He said, I know. She said, You are leaving for England. He said, Yes. She said, Then complicating things seems unnecessary. He said, Yes. Another quiet, longer this time. The lamp put a circle of warm light on the table between them, and the rest of the room was in shadow. She said, Your father. He said, Yes, I should go. She said, Yes. He said, There are things I want to say before I go that I have not said. She said, You should consider carefully whether they are better said or not said. He said, I have been considering it for 3 weeks. She said, And? He said, I have not reached a conclusion. She said, Then perhaps the conclusion is that they are better held. He looked at the window. He said, Perhaps. She looked at her paper. She said, The Northern Tea contracts. If you leave on Thursday, there is time to file the preliminary documentation before the end of the month. I can prepare it. He said, Yes. She said, And the Suzhou matter, I have a letter drafted. You should sign it before you go. He said, Yes. She said, George can manage the remaining negotiations. He is better at them than he knows. He would benefit from the opportunity to manage them without someone looking over his shoulder. He looked at her. He said, You are very efficiently removing my reasons to stay. She said, Your reasons to stay are real. Your reasons to go are also real. I am simply making the practical ones easier to see. He said, What about the reasons that are not practical? She said, Those are yours to weigh. He said, And if I asked you to help me weigh them? She said, Then I would remind you that I am a household interpreter in a trading residence in Shanghai, and you are a viscount with a father who is unwell in England, and a title that does not resolve itself, and a set of responsibilities that have not gone away because you have been here for 6 weeks. He said, None of that changes what I said. She said, No, it doesn't. The lamp burned. The city murmured outside. She said, Go, Edmund. It was the first time she had used his name. She heard herself say it, and something in her chest did something that she noted, and then firmly set aside to examine later when she was alone and in a position to be honest with herself. He heard her say it too. She could tell from the way the air in the room changed slightly. He said, Will you be here when things are resolved and I can come back? She said, I will be here working. He said, That is not the answer to the question I asked. She said, I know, it is the answer I can give. He sat with this. He said, All right. He took the letter from England and folded it into his coat. He said, Good night, Mei Lei. She said, Good night. He went upstairs. She sat at her desk and looked at the contract comparison until the words stopped moving, until the letters resolved themselves back into meaning, and she could read them again rather than just seeing shapes. She worked until 4 in the morning. She filed the documents. She drafted the letter for his signature. She prepared a full set of notes for George on the outstanding matters and the strategies she recommended for each. At 4, she went to the window and looked out at the city. She said to herself quietly, in the voice she used for things she needed to hear but could not say to anyone else, that was the right thing. She was not entirely sure she believed it, but she said it anyway, because sometimes the saying of the right thing is part of the work of eventually meaning it. He left on Thursday as she had said he should. He signed the letter and the documents and shook George's hand and spoke to Bao and to Ping and to Lan, who cried slightly and was embarrassed about it, and he pretended not to notice, which Mei Li observed and which she thought was well done of him. He came to the study where she was working. He put a small package on her desk, he said, for the journey at some point. From a bookseller in the foreign quarter. He said it was in Portuguese, which apparently you are also learning. She looked at the book. She looked at him. She said, Thank you. He said, Take care of George. She said, George takes care of himself more than he knows. He said, You have been good for this house. She said, "The house has been good for me." He said, "May lay." She said, "Edmund." He stood in the doorway of the study for a moment. He said, "I will write." She said, "Letters are useful. I'm experienced in reading them carefully." He said, "I know you are. I will say what I mean." She said, "That would be unusual and greatly appreciated." He said, "Yes." He left. She listened to the sounds of departure, the carriage, the gate, the city receiving him back into itself. Then she looked at the Portuguese grammar book on her desk. She picked it up. She turned it over. She held it in the way you hold something that someone has thought about rather than simply given. She put it on the shelf beside her primer. She picked up her pen. She wrote the first of what would become 61 letters, addressed to Viscount Edmund Ashford, care of the Ashford family estate in Yorkshire, and she wrote it the way she wrote everything, precisely and without waste, and she said in it what was true and accurate and professionally relevant, which was quite a lot, and she said in it nothing else. She read it through. She folded it. She wrote a second letter. She put the second letter in her desk drawer in the back, where it was not visible. She sent the first. The second she would decide about later. That was its own kind of decision, she supposed, keeping it rather than burning it, keeping it rather than sending it, the thing she was not ready to do either way. She went to the window. The jar of tea sat in the light. She thought, he said he would say what he means. She thought, I wonder if he knows what he means yet. She thought, I wonder if I do. The city moved outside. The house moved around her. And she stood at the window in the morning light, 22 years old and more awake than she had ever been, and held the question the way she held her grandfather's jar, carefully without opening it, trusting that when the time was right she would know. The first letter arrived from England in 23 days, which was fast enough to indicate that it had been written and sent without much delay, which was itself information. She read it at her desk on a Tuesday morning. It was 3 pages, written in the clear, unhurried hand of a man who had learned to write in school and had continued to write precisely and consistently ever since. It covered the documentation she had sent, the state of his father's health, which was stable but cautious, the northern contracts, and one paragraph at the end that was about none of these things. That was about a morning he had spent in the estate gardens that reminded him of the garden behind the Shanghai residence, and about how London had felt narrower than he remembered it being. She read that paragraph twice. Then she placed the letter with her work correspondence and wrote a reply that addressed the documentation and the contracts, and asked 2 specific questions about the supplier matters in Yorkshire that were genuine questions, and also gave her legitimate reasons to continue the correspondence. She did not address the paragraph about the gardens. She filed a carbon copy of her reply and sealed the letter and gave it to Bow and went to her next appointment. George noticed the correspondence. She knew he noticed because of the way he did not mention it, which was George's specific method of registering things he had decided not to involve himself in. He was a good man in this particular way. He had a sense of where his business ended. He also, in the months after his brother's departure, became more fully himself in the household, which was what she had told Edmund would happen, and which gave her, privately, a satisfaction that was both professional and something warmer than professional. George began hosting his own small dinners. He began taking positions in the negotiations that were his own positions, rather than positions he thought his brother would approve of, and several of these positions turned out to be better than what Edmund would have decided, because George understood the local texture of things in a way that came from 2 years of daily presence rather than periodic authority visits. She told him this. He said, "Don't flatter me." She said, "I don't flatter people, I observe and report. That is my function." He said, "All right, but it makes me nervous when you say things like that." She said, "It should make you confident." He said, "Yes, that is why it makes me nervous." She understood this. Confidence was frightening when you were not accustomed to being the one in charge of your own decisions. You spent years having someone else responsible for the large things, and then suddenly the large things are yours, and the part of you that was comfortable with deference has to stand down and let the other part of you take over, and the transition was not always easy. She had never had the luxury of deference. She had been responsible for her own large things since she understood what large things were. Perhaps that was why confidence did not feel frightening to her so much as simply functional. Letters continued to arrive from Yorkshire every 3 to 4 weeks, 3 pages each, in the clear, unhurried hand. She replied to each one. Her replies were 2 pages on average, written efficiently. She addressed the professional matters first. She addressed the personal observations with the careful restraint of someone who was writing for the permanent record of a correspondence that she suspected would matter, though she could not have said exactly what she expected it to matter for. In November, he wrote that his father had had a difficult week. In December, he wrote that his father was improving. In January, he wrote that his father was asking about the silk business and about Shanghai, and that this was the clearest sign of genuine improvement he had seen. She wrote back that this was good news. She wrote that George had closed a very significant tea contract that would stabilize their northern supply for 3 years. She wrote at the end that the garden had been properly attended to and that the west wall had bloomed in the late autumn in a way that Ping claimed was significant, though she was not certain of the exact nature of the significance. He wrote back, "What did Ping say?" She wrote back, "Ping says that late blooming is a sign of things done properly in difficult conditions. I'm not sure whether this refers to the garden or to something else. With Ping it is sometimes difficult to know." He wrote back, "I think I know which she meant." She wrote back nothing to this. She moved to the next professional matter. He wrote in February, "I want to ask you something directly. My father has been clear that I am needed in England for the foreseeable future, and managing the family's interests from a distance has become untenable. I am going to recall George to take on responsibilities here. I will need someone in Shanghai to manage the Caldwell House interests directly, someone who knows the work and the people and the networks we have built. I believe that person is you. I am writing to ask if you would accept that position." She read this letter 3 times. The first time she read it as what it was, a professional proposal. The second time she read it for what else it might be, which was a question inside the question, a question about what she was willing to be and where and for whom. The third time she read it very carefully to make sure she had understood it correctly, because in her experience letters that seemed to say one thing, while meaning several things, were best understood by reading them until all the meanings were clear, even the ones the writer might not have been fully conscious of when they wrote. She set the letter on her desk. She sat with it for 24 hours, not because she did not know her answer, which she did, with the same clarity she had known most things that mattered, but because the answer had implications she wanted to follow to their ends before she spoke them. If she accepted, she would be the head of a British trading house operation in Shanghai. At 23 years old, a Chinese woman, the first. She had no illusion about what the foreign quarter would make of this. She had no illusion about what the Chinese merchants would make of it either, at least initially, though she suspected that the Chinese merchants would come around faster once they saw what she could do, because Chinese merchants were, in her experience, primarily interested in what worked. If she declined, she would go back to what? Her father's house in Suzhou. The situation that had produced her arrangement in the first place had not improved. Her father's letters, 2 a year, careful and factual, confirmed this without stating it directly. She had no life to return to, not in the way that had existed before, because she was not the person who had left Suzhou anymore, and Suzhou was not in the habit of receiving different versions of the people it had originally sent away. She could find another position. She was qualified, more qualified than she had been. She was known now in the commercial circles of Shanghai as a person of precise judgment and excellent languages, and the ability to navigate spaces that were not originally designed for her. But the question was not really about alternatives. The question was about the question inside the question. She wrote her reply on the morning of the second day. She said, "Yes, I accept the position. I will require 3 conditions to be met before I can begin. The first is a formal letter of appointment from the Caldwell Trading House that establishes my authority in writing, so that it is not informal or subject to revision when someone finds it inconvenient. The second is a salary that reflects the scope of the work, and not the assumptions that are typically attached to people who look like me and do this kind of work. The third I will tell you when we are in the same room." She sealed the letter. She held it for a moment before giving it to Bao. She thought, "This is real. This is what I am doing, not what someone else decided I should do, or what the situation required me to do, or what my father arranged without my input. This is what I have chosen." She gave Bao the letter. She went to tell George. He took the news of his own recall with the expression of a man who has been offered a thing he wanted and is trying to determine whether he deserves it. She watched him carefully, and when the wanting and the deserving were done negotiating behind his eyes, she said, "You are ready. You have been ready. Going home and doing the work there is not a lesser thing." He said, "He chose you." She said, "Yes." He said, "He was right." She said, "Yes, I think so." He said, "Do you know what you're taking on?" She said, "I have a reasonable estimate of it." He said, "The foreign quarter will not like it." She said, Some of them will find that what I do works and will like that well enough to manage their other feelings." He said, "And the ones who can't manage their other feelings," she said, "will have to take their business elsewhere. That is their right. We will survive without them." He said, "You say we still." She said, "I represent the house's interests. That is we." He said, "All right." He poured them each a glass of the good wine, the kind he saved for occasions. He said, "To you." She said, "To the work." He said, "Both." The formal letter of appointment arrived 4 weeks later. It was on Caldwell Trading House stationery, signed by the senior partner in London, and it stated her name, her title, and her authority in language that was clear and unambiguous, and she noted with some satisfaction, left no room for the kind of quiet revision that could happen when authority was granted informally, and then gradually eroded by the discomfort of the people around it. She framed it not on the wall of the office, in the drawer of her desk, folded precisely, available. She knew it was there, that was sufficient. George's departure was quiet and complicated in the way of departures that involve people who have come to rely on each other and who are too restrained to say so. She organized his packing. She briefed him on every outstanding matter. She wrote him a 12-page document of notes, observations, and context that she titled, accurately, "Everything I think you need to know but have been too polite to ask directly." He read it at the dock before the ship came. He looked up from the last page. He said, "Hollies." She said, "Yes. He has been quietly spreading the opinion that the appointment is a foreign policy question rather than a commercial one. He will increase the frequency of this once I am formally in post. I have a record of every instance and a network of people who will inform me of new ones. He is not dangerous, but he is persistent." He said, "And?" She said, "And I am more persistent." He said, "I know." He folded the document. He held it for a moment. He said, "My brother is a private person. He does not speak about personal things easily." She said, "I have noticed." He said, "But he writes to you." She said, "Yes, on business matters." He said, "Yes, he told me." They stood at the dock with the sound of the harbor around them and the ship in the distance, coming in. He said, "Take care of yourself." She said, "I always have." He said, "I know, but you are allowed to also." The ship arrived. He went up the gangplank. He turned at the top and raised a hand. She raised hers. She stood on the dock until the ship was gone. Then she turned back toward the city that was now her responsibility and walked into it on her crutch, steady and unhurried, and Shanghai parted around her the way cities part around people who are clearly going somewhere, and she went. Running the Caldwell Trading House's Shanghai interests was not a single large thing. It was several hundred small things done correctly, every day, without the small things being allowed to become large ones. She understood this from the first week. She had been watching how it worked for months before it was hers to manage, which was the advantage of having spent nearly a year being present and careful in a house where no one had expected her to be paying that level of attention. She already knew where the problems lived. She already knew who could be trusted and who required watching, and which of the local traders preferred directness, and which required the longer, more formal approach where the point was reached only after sufficient time had been spent on the path to it. She took over on the 1st of June. She sent a letter to each of the Caldwell House's trading partners in Shanghai and the surrounding region. The letter was brief. It said she had been appointed to manage the house's interests. It gave the date. It stated that she expected the current agreements to continue under the same terms and that any matters requiring attention should be directed to her. It was signed with her full name and the house's seal. The responses came in over the following week. Most were professional. 2 were curious in the way that questions are curious, testing the edges to see what kind of answer would come back. 3 were warm, which she had not expected, and which she received without performance, which is to say she acknowledged them and moved to the next matter. 1 came from Holly's, though it was not from Holly's directly. It was from one of Holly's associates in the foreign quarter, a man named Grant, and it asked, in language that was formally polite and actually not polite at all, whether the appointment had been confirmed by the full London partnership or only by the Viscount's personal instruction. She wrote back the same day with the full partnership letter attached. She did not add commentary. The document said what it said, and she had learned long ago that adding commentary to something that speaks clearly for itself suggests you are not confident that it does. She heard nothing further from Grant. Holly's she managed the way she had told George she would manage him, by being more patient and more persistent than he was. He could not outwork her. He could not outknow her. He could spread opinions, but opinions ran into the harder material of results, and her results over the first 6 months were the kind that made opinions difficult to sustain. She secured 3 new supply agreements in the first quarter, 2 of which were relationships the Caldwell house had tried and failed to establish for several years. She did this not through any dramatic negotiation, but through the patient process of actually understanding what the other party wanted and finding a way to meet those needs while meeting the house's own, which was the entire mechanism of trade, and yet which many traders treated as a secondary consideration to the performance of strength. She closed the Suzhou supplier matter definitively and cleanly, with documentation that stood up to 3 layers of legal review and that left the former supplier without recourse and without a viable complaint. She had spent 6 weeks preparing it. It was the cleanest piece of commercial correspondence she had ever produced, and she would have been proud of it if she were the kind of person who found pride in paperwork, which she was not, but she found something. Satisfaction, perhaps. The satisfaction of a problem solved completely and correctly. The letters from England continued, monthly now, sometimes more, 3 pages, always in the clear hand, always covering the relevant business matters first and then, toward the end, something else. The estate gardens. A conversation with his father. A book he was reading that he thought she would have opinions about, which she always did, and which she communicated in her replies in the 2 pages she wrote back, covering the business first and then, toward the end, the opinions. In July he wrote about the estate's village school, which had been struggling since the teacher had left in the spring. He wrote that his mother had suggested hiring from London, but that the distance made finding someone suitable difficult. In August she wrote back, "I teach here on Thursday mornings, the local school 3 streets from the residence. I began in April. I thought it might be relevant context." He wrote back, "How did that happen?" She wrote back, "I went to see what the school was, and the teacher was managing too many children with not enough support, and I had 3 hours on Thursday mornings that were not filled with work that could not wait. It seemed logical." He wrote back, "Of course it did." She wrote back, "Your estate village, what does it need?" He wrote back a long answer that told her what the village needed, which was precisely the kind of information she had been asking for, and which told her other things besides, the way his attention had always told her things, the way his answers were always more complete than the questions required. She read those letters carefully, she filed them. She reread them sometimes at night when the work was done and the house was quiet, because they were, she had privately acknowledged, the most genuinely interesting reading material she had in the house, and she was not going to be dishonest with herself about that. The 3rd condition. She had not yet told him the 3rd condition. She turned this over occasionally, in the way you turn something over when you are not avoiding it but are not yet ready to face it directly. The 3rd condition was not a mystery to her. She knew what it was. She had known when she wrote it. She simply had not said it because saying it required saying it in a room with him, in person, where the saying of it could be seen for what it was. The business required her in Shanghai. The business also, she noted with precision, required him to send someone to review the operations at least once per year, this being standard practice for major trading house appointments. She noted when the year would be complete. She noted when, therefore, he would be due. She made sure the first year's operations produced the kind of results that would be noticed in London. They were noticed. She received a formal letter from the senior partnership expressing their satisfaction, which she placed with her appointment letter in the back of the desk drawer. She received also a personal letter, arriving 2 days after the formal one, 3 pages, covering the partnership's satisfaction and a number of other things, and at the end, "I will be in Shanghai in the spring." There are matters that require personal review. I will need an interpreter." She smiled. She did not let anyone see her smile. She wrote back, "I will be available to assist with any interpretation needs. The spring is a good time. The garden looks well in spring. Ping says the late blooming things have set well this year." He wrote back, "You are enjoying this." She wrote back, "That would be unprofessional." He wrote back, "Yes, and." She wrote back nothing for 3 weeks on that particular thread of conversation. She was busy. She had a school to run on Thursday mornings and 3 supply chains to manage, and a house to direct and 63 contacts in Shanghai and the surrounding region to maintain, and a Holly's situation to keep an eye on and a Portuguese grammar to finish, which she did in December with the particular satisfaction of completing a thing you started. She put the Portuguese grammar on the shelf beside the English primer. She stood in front of the shelf and looked at both of them for a moment. The primer was worn now, the spine going at the edges, the margins full of her notes in 2 different inks, the earlier notes in the careful hand of someone learning and the later ones in the faster hand of someone who knows and is noting something particular. She thought, "I read this in a house in Suzhou at 5 in the morning with a candle burning down, and my father asleep down the hall, and no idea what I was moving toward." She thought, and here I am. The house was quiet around her. Bao had gone home. Lan was in her room. Ping had left a pot of something warm on the kitchen stove, which she did every evening as a small unmarked act of care that Mei Li had learned to receive without comment, because Ping received acknowledgement through the medium of what she put on the stove rather than through words. She went to the kitchen and found the pot and poured a bowl and carried it to the study and sat at her desk. She thought about the year. She thought about what it had been to be responsible for something, fully and without someone else's authority behind her as a safety net. She thought about the merchants who had tested her, and the ones who had not, and the ones who had eventually stopped testing her, because they had concluded from evidence that she was exactly what she presented herself as being. She thought about the school on Thursday mornings and the 6 children who had started the year unable to read and who now could, and the way this fact sat in her with a different kind of weight than the commercial accomplishments, a quieter weight, the kind that settled in rather than announcing itself. She thought about 61 letters. She had counted them. She counted them the way she counted threads, the way she counted fish on the borders of plates when something was happening that she was not ready to fully look at. She thought, one more and he will be here, and the 3rd condition. She ate her soup. She went to her room. She opened the desk drawer in the back where the unsent letter lived, the one she had written in June of the previous year and had not sent and had not destroyed, and she took it out and she read it. She had been 22 when she wrote it. She was 23 now and would be 24 in March. The letter was still true. That was what she found when she read it. Everything in it was still true. She had not changed her mind about any of it. She had simply been uncertain whether to give it a life outside herself, whether to make it real to another person, or whether some things were better kept inside their own container. She put the letter back. She looked at the jar of tea on the windowsill. It had moved with her from room to room as the household had arranged itself over the year, and she had been given the larger room that looked east rather than north, and now it sat in the east light every morning and she looked at it when she woke. She thought about the spring. She thought about the garden in the spring, and the west wall that bloomed late and well, and the lanterns that were still up from a festival that had long since ended, but that no one had taken down because they were still beautiful, and beauty did not require justification. She thought, spring is 4 months. She picked up her pen. She began to write the 62nd letter. Business first as always, supply chains, the school, the 3rd quarter numbers which were excellent, a development with the Eastern Dock agreement that required his attention, 3 questions she needed answers to before the end of the fiscal year. And then, at the end, in the space where she sometimes wrote the other things, I want to say something I have been considering how to say for approximately 1 year. She stopped, she read back what she had written. She thought, this is the thing I have been working toward without naming it. All the precise questions and the margin notes and the efficient letters, and the years of practice at saying exactly what I mean and trusting the person reading it to receive what I have said without requiring me to say more than I know. She thought, he said he would say what he means. He has been saying it for a year, in the space between the business matters in the paragraph about the garden and the letter about the London streets feeling narrower. She thought, it is time. She finished the letter. She wrote the thing she had been considering how to say. She wrote it simply, which is the only way to write things that are true, and she said what she meant without decoration and without qualification. She sealed it before she could reconsider. She put it with the morning correspondence. She did not lie awake. She had said what was true, and true things do not require the anxiety that uncertain things do. She opened her primer to a page she had read 20 times, ran through the familiar words and slept. The reply came in 31 days, which was faster than usual, which was itself an answer before she read the words. She read the words. She held the letter for a long time. The spring was 4 months, then it was 3. Then it was 1, and Shanghai moved into the warmer air with the particular opening that spring brought, the gardens loosening, the smells changing, the light coming later and staying longer. She had the west wall looked to. She told Ping. Ping said nothing. She turned back to the stove and added something to the pot with the expression of someone who has known things all along and is satisfied to now be in a position where knowing them is no longer required to be private. He arrived on a Wednesday in March, which was not the day she had anticipated. She had been expecting Friday, based on the shipping records she monitored as a matter of routine, and she had arranged her week accordingly. When Bao came to the study at 10:30 on a Wednesday morning and said, with the precision he always brought to significant information, "The carriage is at the gate," she looked up from her work and understood that the shipping records had been optimistic about the winds. She put down her pen. She straightened the papers on her desk with the unnecessary care of someone giving themselves a moment. She stood, took her crutch, and went to the front room. He was in the courtyard when she reached the window, speaking with Bao about the luggage, which gave her a few seconds before the introduction had to happen. She used those seconds the way she used all seconds that contained information, to look and understand and file. He was thinner than she remembered. The English winter, perhaps, or his father's illness, or the particular drain of months spent managing things from a distance when you were the kind of person who managed things better in person. He had his coat on still and his hat in his hand, and he was listening to something Bao was saying with the total attention that was so particular to him, that quality of actually being present in a conversation rather than simply occupying it. He looked up toward the window. She stepped back, not hiding exactly, more simply remembering that she was at a window rather than in the room. She went to the front room. He came in a moment later. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped too. They looked at each other in the way of people who have been writing letters for a year and are now in the same physical space, and are finding that the space is different from the letters in ways that are both smaller and larger than expected. He said, "You look well." She said, "You look like the English winter agreed with you less than you would have liked." He said, "That is accurate. It was a difficult few months." She said, "Your father." He said, improving, slowly, "He is asking about Shanghai." He read the third quarter report which someone was unwise enough to leave on the table near his chair. She said, "And?" He said, "He says if he had known about you 2 years ago he would have come here himself." She said, "He should not travel at his age." He said, "He says the same thing and has said it for 30 years and has not let it stop him." She said, "In that case I hope he waits until spring at the earliest." He said, "I will tell him you said so, he will like that." She said, "Come inside. Ping has made something." She always makes something when she knows in advance that someone is coming, and she does not accept the theory that 2 days instead of 4 is insufficient notice. He said, "Ping is always right about these things." She said, "Yes, she usually is." They went to the dining room, where Ping had indeed made something, a full meal that occupied the table with the particular confidence of someone who believes that feeding people is the most direct available form of care, and has spent 50 years perfecting its execution. They ate, they talked about the business, which was the natural starting place and also the honest one, because the business was what they had built between them over 12 months of letters, and it was real and it mattered, and starting, there was not a way of avoiding the other things, but a way of honoring the actual structure of what existed between them. She reported the first quarter numbers which he had mostly seen in writing but which became different in the telling, the texture of them, the stories behind the figures. He asked good questions. He had always asked good questions. A year of reading her letters had made him better at knowing which questions she had the information to answer and which ones she was still working on. After the meal, she took him through the study where the operational files were kept. He had asked to see the filing system she had developed, which she had described in letters but which, like all systems, required the actual presence of the thing to be fully understood. She showed him. He looked at it carefully. He said, "This is not how the London office files things." She said, "The London office files things for London. I file for here." He said, "Yes, and your way is better." She said, "It is better for this work in this place with these people. Whether it would be better in London I couldn't say. I have not been to London." He said, "You should come to London." She said, "That is a large suggestion." He said, "I am aware." She looked at the files, he looked at the files. The study was familiar around her, the desk where she worked every morning, the shelf with the primer and the Portuguese grammar, the jar of tea that she had moved to this room when she moved from the smaller room to the larger one, because she preferred it to be where she worked rather than where she slept. He saw the jar, he looked at it for a moment. He said, "You didn't open it." She said, "No, not yet." He said, "What are you waiting for?" She said, "I don't know exactly, I'll know when it's time." He said, "All right." He looked at the shelf, he looked at the primer worn and margined. He said, "You finished the Portuguese grammar." She said, "In December." He said, "And?" She said, "Portuguese is harder than English. The subjunctive works differently. I have opinions about it." He said, "I'd like to hear them." She said, "You might regret that." He said, "I doubt it." He stayed for 3 weeks. The formal part of the visit was extensive and she managed all of it. The meetings with the major trading partners, the review of the contracts, the quarterly accounting, the assessment of the new agreements she had established. He attended everything and observed and asked questions and made decisions. And the decisions were good, and several of them were good because she had already laid the groundwork in the letters, and he had understood and arrived already knowing what he thought. This was what she had found most unusual about him from the beginning, and had continued to find unusual. He arrived at things already thinking, not waiting to be told what to conclude. He received information and then made his own sense of it, which was not as common as it should have been. Holly's was dealt with in the second week. He had been more active recently, the network she maintained had told her, more vocal in the foreign quarter about the appropriateness of her position, more pointed in the language he was using. The situation had remained manageable, but had moved from background noise to something that required direct attention. Edmund handled it himself, which she had not asked him to do and had not expected. He met with Holly's privately. She was not present. She did not know exactly what was said. What she observed afterward was that Holly's left Shanghai within the month, transferred to a position in Singapore at his own request, and that he did not say a public goodbye, and that no one who knew the situation pretended not to understand why. She did not thank Edmund for this. She had told him once that she did not thank people for basic decency, and that had not changed. He did not appear to expect thanks. On the last evening before his scheduled departure, they sat in the garden. The lanterns from the last festival were still up. They always seemed to be still up. She suspected Bao had taken them down and quietly replaced them at some point, understanding that certain things should simply always be there. She said, "The third condition." He looked at her. She said, "You asked me to tell you in person. You are in person." He said, "I remember." She said, "The condition is that whatever this is, it is mine as well as yours, not something given and received, not something arranged, not something that happens to me while I am standing in a courtyard waiting to see what has been decided. Mine, chosen with full knowledge of what I am choosing and why." He said, "Yes." She said, "That's all, that is the condition." He said, "It is a very simple condition." She said, "Simple things are usually the ones that matter most." He said, "Yes." He looked at the lanterns, she looked at them too. He said, "I have been thinking about what you wrote, in November, the letter." She said, "I know." He said, "I have read it many times." She said, "I know that too." He said, "How?" She said, "Because you wrote back in 24 hours, which is not your usual speed, which meant you had already read it more than once before you responded." He said, "You count everything." She said, I notice everything, there is a difference. He said, yes, I think I know now what the difference is. The garden moved around them in the light. The city made its sounds beyond the walls. Somewhere inside the house, Ping was in the kitchen making something for tomorrow morning, which she always did, because some people expressed their understanding of situations through food rather than speech, and this was a perfectly functional method of communication that she had come to rely on. He said, Mei Lei. She said, yes. He said, I want to be clear about what I am saying. She said, then be clear. He said, I am asking if you will come to England, not as an employee, not as part of the house's arrangements, as the person I intend to spend the rest of my life with if you are willing, which I understand you may not be, given the particular nature of what that would mean in practice. She said, I know what it would mean in practice. He said, you have considered it. She said, I have been considering it for 1 year. He said, and? She said, I have 3 things to finish here first. The Eastern Dock Agreement needs to close. The school needs a permanent teacher before I can remove myself from Thursday mornings. And I want to find someone I trust to manage the Shanghai operation while I am absent, because I intend to continue to be involved, and I will not hand it to someone who does not know the work. He said, is that a yes? She said, those are my conditions. He said, how long? She said, 6 months if everything proceeds as I expect. He said, I can wait 6 months. She said, I know you can. You waited a year before coming back. He said, that was circumstances. She said, it was also patience. The two can coexist. He said, are you going to make me say it out loud? She said, I think it should be said out loud, yes. I think out loud is the appropriate register for this particular statement. He looked at her with the expression she had catalogued and still did not have a name for, the one that was present and direct, and contained something she was not able to reduce to data because it was not data. It was something of a different nature altogether. He said directly and clearly and without performance, which was exactly how she had known he would say it, I love you. She sat with this for the correct amount of time, which was long enough to receive it properly and not so long that it became a test. She said, I have loved you since you asked about the 3rd quarter tea pricing at 2 in the morning in the study. He said, that was our 2nd week together. She said, I said what I said. He said, you waited a year to tell me. She said, I was working out the practical implications. He laughed, the real one from somewhere below the surface of the social one, the one that went its full length. She listened to it and found it entirely satisfying. She did not cry. She had not been expecting to, and she did not. She felt something large and warm and very clear, the way you feel when something you have been holding carefully for a long time is finally safe enough to set down. She reached across the small table between them and put her hand on top of his, the right one, the one with 2 fingers absent from below the knuckle, and she left it there. He turned his hand and held hers. They sat in the garden until the lanterns were the main light and the city was settled into its night version of itself, and they talked, and the talking was the kind that has no agenda and no end time and carries no performance of anything. That is simply 2 people in a garden who have finally, after a great deal of patience and work and letter writing and careful watching, arrived in the same place at the same time. She thought, this is what I was waiting for. She thought not the person, though the person, but the arriving by choice and by work and by the long, patient process of becoming exactly the person who was capable of recognizing this when it appeared. Inside the house, Ping made a sound in the kitchen that might have been the movement of a pot. It might also have been satisfaction. With Ping, she had learned it was often both. The 6 months she had predicted took 7. The Eastern Dock Agreement was the reason. The final terms required 3 additional rounds of negotiation that she had not fully anticipated, which taught her something about predictions regarding agreements that involved Chaos family, which was that Chaos family always required 1 more round than you planned for, and this was not stubbornness, but a form of cultural thoroughness that she had come to understand was actually producing better agreements because they were more completely considered by both sides. She was not impatient. She was busy, which was a different condition from being impatient and a better one. The school she had managed by October. She found a teacher through a connection Wei had provided, a young woman from a family in Nanjing who had trained in Shanghai and who was better in the classroom than Mei Li was, because Mei Li had always been better with documents than with people in large groups, a limitation she assessed honestly and without making it larger than it was. She brought the new teacher in during August, spent 6 weeks working alongside her on Thursday mornings, and then stepped back, which was the correct sequence and which required more discipline than it might appear from the outside, the discipline of building something and then releasing it to someone else to carry, trusting that the building was solid enough to hold. The Shanghai operation she placed with a man named Wen, 40 years old, formerly of the KO Trading Network, who had come to her attention 3 months earlier as someone who possessed the unusual combination of commercial intelligence and genuine trustworthiness that the position required. She spent 2 months working him through the full operational picture. She introduced him to every significant contact. She prepared for him a document that was longer and more detailed than the one she had written for George Ashford, because George had known the foreign business context, and Wen had to be given her understanding of both worlds simultaneously. She wrote 64 letters to England during this period, not all of them to Edmund, though most were. She wrote to George twice, about matters of common interest, and also to tell him how things were developing. He wrote back letters that were warm in the way he had always been warm when he was not performing the role of the careful younger brother of someone more senior than himself, and reading them she thought, England did him good, just as Shanghai had done her good, just as leaving the house where you were defined by someone else's ledger, and going somewhere you had to define yourself was the thing that made a person into their actual shape, rather than the shape other people had assigned them. She thought about this sometimes when she was sorting files at the end of the day, when the work was done and the house was settling, in the quiet that came in the early evening before the city noise found its night register. She thought, I was 22 years old and my father sold me for cotton and a loan forgiveness. She thought, and I became the head of a British trading house in Shanghai. I taught a school. I wrote 64 letters to a man who listened to everyone. I carried my grandfather's crutch and his sealed tea jar and his belief that a girl with a good mind was worth educating. She thought the ledger my father kept in his head never had the right entries in it. He was counting the wrong things entirely. Her father came before she left, not to Shanghai. She went to Suzhou. She took 3 days, arranged Wen into the office for the duration, and took the train to Suzhou and arrived at the house she had grown up in and stood at the gate. The house was smaller than she remembered, which was not the house having changed, but her having grown in the intervening 2 years beyond the dimensions the house had set for her. Her father met her in the front room. He had aged since she left. He was still the same person, still the same quality of calculating and insufficient, and not precisely cruel but not able to be kind either, not able to give to people what they needed when what they needed cost him something. He was still her father, which was the most complicated sentence in her life. He asked about her work, she told him. He absorbed it with the expression of a man who had sent away something he thought he understood, and has discovered that what he actually sent was something he had not adequately assessed. He said, "You are doing well." She said, "Yes." He said, "I am glad for it." She said, "I know." He said, "The house has been difficult, the business." She said, "Yes, I know." She opened the bag she had brought and gave him an envelope. He looked at it. He did not open it there. He said, "This is not necessary." She said, "I know it is not. It is also not in question." He said nothing more. They drank tea together in the front room where he had told her about the arrangement, 2.5 years before, looking past her at the right shoulder where the version of her he wished she had been standing. He did not look past her now. He looked at her directly, which was either different or she was different, and she had decided it did not matter which. She looked directly back. She said, "The plum tree." He said, "It bloomed this year. Very well, the best it has in years." She said, "Good." She stayed one night. She slept in her old room, the small one, and looked at the window through which she had read by candlelight at 5 in the morning while the house slept, and she felt the distance between that version of herself and this one the way you feel the distance between 2 banks of a river, a real distance, one that was crossed by swimming rather than by any other method. She left in the morning. She did not hug him. He stood in the doorway and said something about writing. She said she would. She turned and walked down the road to the station and did not look back. She went to England in November. She brought one trunk, the crutch, her books wrapped in cloth, The jar of tea still sealed, which she placed very carefully in the center of the trunk where nothing could shift against it. The voyage was 5 weeks. She spent them reading and writing and standing at the ship's rail when the weather permitted, watching the water change as they moved from the warm seas to the cold ones, watching the color shift from the deep green-blue of the south to the gray-green of the north, and thinking about what was at the other end of this water and what it would be. Edmund met her at the port. She had told him she did not require meeting, that she was fully capable of managing a port arrival, and he had written back that he was aware of that, and that he would be at the port anyway, which was, she had decided, the correct answer. He was at the port. He was standing near the gate in a coat, and his hat in his hand in the particular posture he had of someone waiting for something specific. She saw him before he saw her, because she always saw things first, and she watched him looking for her in the crowd for a moment before he found her. When he found her, his expression did the thing she had never fully named, the thing she had stopped trying to name, that required a different language than she had yet found. She came through the gate on her crutch. He said, "You look well." She said, "You look less like the English winter, had you in a hold for 5 months." He said, "It was a better autumn than last year." She said, "Good." He held the carriage door. She got in, and he got in, and they went. England was large and grey and green all at once, and wet in a way that she had been told about, and which was nevertheless different from being told about it. And London was enormous and crowded with the particular self-importance of a city that had decided it was the center of things, and had arranged its entire physical self to support this conclusion. She watched it from the carriage window. She thought, every city believes it is the center. From inside any city it looks entirely different from the outside. This is the nature of perspective, rather than of any particular place. The estate was outside London by 2 hours' travel. She had known this from his letters. She had known the number of rooms and the layout of the east wing and the condition of the west garden, and the fact that the housekeeper had been with the family for 32 years, which meant she would have to be approached carefully and with patience, and with the full understanding that her loyalty was to the family rather than to any particular arrangement, and that earning her respect would take longer than earning the respect of the merchants in Shanghai, because it would require a different kind of proof. She had been thinking about this for months. She had a plan. The carriage arrived at the estate at dusk. The house presented itself in the last light of a November afternoon, large and stone and old in the specific way of English buildings, old with the kind of weight that comes from actual age rather than the appearance of it. She looked at it through the carriage window. She looked at the steps leading to the front door. There were 8 of them. She thought 47 inside, 8 outside, total 55, more than Shanghai by 11. She thought, I have counted worse things. The carriage stopped. Edmund got out and held the door. She got out with her crutch. They stood at the bottom of the 8 steps. The front door opened, and the housekeeper came to the top of the steps. A woman of about 60 with the face of someone who has maintained the same standard for 32 years and intends to continue doing so. Her name, Mei Lei knew, was Mrs. Fielding. She looked at Mei Lei with the specific look of someone conducting an assessment. Mei Lei looked back at Mrs. Fielding with the specific look of someone who has been assessed by more formidable people than this, and is not frightened, but is paying attention. A moment of measured silence. Then Mrs. Fielding said, "The east wing has had the hearth attended to, my lord, and tea is ready." She said it to Edmund, but she looked at the end at Mei Lei, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Mei Lei said, "Thank you, Mrs. Fielding." Mrs. Fielding said, "Of course." She went back inside. Edmund said, very quietly, "She has not said of course to someone in the same hour as their arrival in the 20 years I have known her." Mei Lei said, "I will take that." She climbed the 8 steps on her crutch, steady and unhurried, and went into the house. The following years were the following years, which is to say they were full and complicated and ordinary and extraordinary, in the way that lives are all of these things simultaneously, and she was not going to reduce them to a summary when they were worth being lived. She managed the estate correspondence. She managed the Caldwell House Shanghai interests from a distance, through Wen, who proved to be as good as she had assessed. She built a relationship with the village that began with wariness on their part and careful respect on hers, and moved, over time, through the natural process of people discovering that another person is consistently exactly who they present themselves to be, into something that functioned, and then, for some of them, into something warmer. She taught at the village school on Wednesdays. She chose Wednesday because she had chosen Thursday in Shanghai and wanted this to be its own thing. She became known, in time in the region, as the woman at the Ashford estate who wrote letters that solved problems that had resisted other methods. She was not unknown in London either, in particular commercial and legal circles where her name appeared on documents that stood up to examination, and where her judgment, quietly and then less quietly, was asked for. Edmund's father liked her. This was not immediate, but it was complete once it happened, which was the pattern of him, the pattern of the family, to take time arriving at a position and then hold it without further question. The elder lord had recovered more fully than the difficult winter had suggested he would. He sat in the chair by the east window with his tea and his reports, and he talked to her about his younger days in the textile trade, which she listened to with the attention she gave everything, and which she also found genuinely interesting, because the textile trade connected in her mind directly to the silk room in Suzhou, where she had sat at 5 years old counting threads, and the way a thing begun in one place and time can run forward in ways that the beginning could not have predicted. She told the old lord about her grandfather, which she had not planned to do, but which seemed, in the way of things that seem right rather than decided, appropriate. He said, "He sounds like a man who understood what mattered." She said, "Yes. He was the first person who made me feel that what I was mattered, not what I could do or what I cost or whether I fit into the expected shape, just what I actually was." He said he was right to do that. She said, "Yes." She sat in the east window room and the light came through and she thought about the letter she had written 6 years before, the unsent one in the desk drawer in Shanghai. Wen had sent her things when she left, the practical items, and she had asked him to send the letter too because she wanted it, not to send it, just to have it. It was in the drawer of her desk in the east wing of the estate in Yorkshire. She had read it once since arriving. It was still true. Everything in it was still true. She had not needed to send it because everything in it had been communicated through 64 letters, and a third condition, and a garden at night, and a carriage door held open at a port in November. She had kept it anyway. Some things you keep not because they need to be used, but because they are part of the truth of who you were and what you carried, and carrying them forward is its own kind of honoring the person who held them. On a morning in early spring, she opened the jar of tea. She had not planned to do it that morning specifically. She had woken at 5, as she always did, by habit, and by something that was still in her that remembered candlelight and primers and the particular quality of early morning quiet. She had gone to the desk. She had looked out the window at the estate grounds in the first light. She had looked at the jar. She had known. She took it carefully and broke the seal her grandfather had made 37 years before, and opened it. The smell was extraordinary, old and clear and deep, the specific dry sweetness of very good tea that had been sealed for a long time, and behind it something she had no precise name for, the smell of her grandfather's hands, of the silk room of a life in Suzhou before everything changed, of the specific morning quality of a place she could not go back to but which was still, in some way she had never been able to fully articulate, inside her. She sat with the open jar for a long time. Edmund came in at 7, as he usually did, with 2 cups of whatever Fielding had prepared. He stopped when he saw the open jar. He looked at her face. He said nothing. He sat down across from her. She said, "I used about 1/3 of it to brew this. There is enough left for a few more." She gave him the cup she had brewed from the open jar. He held it, he looked at it, he said, "Thank you." She said, "It is very good tea." He said, "Yes." He drank, she drank. Outside the east window, the estate grounds moved in the early light. The old gardens were beginning their spring opening, the particular slow emergence of the northern growing season, slower than Suzhou, different in all its specific rhythms, but genuine. Things grew here, things lasted. She thought, "My grandfather sealed this 37 years ago." She thought, "He handed it to me and looked at me in a way I did not fully understand yet." She understood it now. He had given her something to carry, not because it would keep her safe, not because it would solve the problems she was going to have, but because it was good and real and worth carrying, and because he had believed that she was the kind of person who would carry things worth carrying all the way to where they needed to go. She had carried the jar and the crutch and the primer and the 22 years and the Shanghai house and the school on Thursday mornings and the 64 letters and the third condition and all the rest of it, forward across the distance that could not be measured in miles, into this room in this light with this cup of tea in her hands. She thought he was right about me. She thought I was right about myself. She put the cup down, she picked up her pen. She had letters to write, contracts to review, a school matter to address, 3 items of estate business that needed attention before the week was out. She began. She was 26 years old, and she had only just started.